Dave, I want to welcome all of our listeners, all of our members of the Vino Veritas Society to a very special, a very unusual kind of podcast. I mean, unusual for us. We're usually sitting in this cramped little studio, and today we're sitting here looking over Grand Lake, Colorado.
You know, we've been playing with this a lot and all of the technology and all that, trying to get it work. And we're all in the dark a little bit on some of our pictures. They want to see that anyway. So what's the difference?
The lake's lit up. That's right. What matters.
They have the good view. I don't know about you and I. Not all things are created equal,
and,
right?
You know, this is an amazing event that happens here in Grand Lake. This is the 10th anniversary. It's hard to believe it's been 10 years that the good people of Grand Lake, Colorado decided they decided the United States Constitution matters and we should be talking about it. And so they turned it into a civic event for citizens to get together, not just for a day. Constitution Day is September 17th. We'll talk about that in just a minute. They turned it into an entire week-long celebration that has included all kinds of fun things. They've had barbecue contests, they've had music, they've had races, they've had fireworks, and they bring in people who actually care about the Constitution, study the Constitution, to talk about the Constitution.
You left out one of the coolest things, and we've got two people actually. So this is the first time we've actually had people in the audience listening to us. One of the cool things they did last year, and they're doing again this year, they're doing a flyover in Grand Lake, Colorado.
That's right.
We have F-16s doing a flyover on Saturday, so it all should be really cool to watch.
So, kudos to Grand Lake for doing this. I'm going to throw this out right at the beginning. If more communities across the United States were doing more things like this, citizens getting together and just talking about the Constitution, not only what it means, but why it matters, why we should care about it, the United States today would be in far better shape than it actually is. We might be something like a constitutional republic.
It would be. For what it's worth, I should give a little kudos to one of our chapters. We have our chapter number 4, Alexander Hamilton, chapter number 4 in Fort Collins, Colorado, is doing a Constitution Night celebration. So they are doing something. Their chapter docent, I don't know if you know this story yet. Their chapter docent, Keith, who we talk about quite a bit, Keith has written what I understand to be a script, a screenplay of sorts that is going to be acted out over the course of their evening. So they're going to tell some of the story of the Constitution through drama.
And no one should be surprised when that script shows up on Broadway 2 or 3 years down the road. So let's talk a few words about Constitution Week and Constitution Day.
Sure.
The week revolves around September 17th, which is the day historically after that long, miserable, hot, humid summer in 1787. There were delegates to the Constitutional Convention. They met during the day at Independence Hall, trying to hammer out a new constitution for this new republic. And then they spent most of their evenings. There's a little tavern, the old city tavern right down the street, where they would go and drink beer. And I'm convinced that's where most of the brainstorming actually happened.
It's why we're the Vino Veritas Society.
That's right.
You said something. You said a hot, humid day in September, right?
Mm-hmm.
People need to really think about this all the way back. This isn't a plane flight for people from Georgia, from South Carolina. They weren't jumping on a plane and flying up to Philadelphia.
That's right.
They were trudging through the summer in the heat and the humidity and the bugs of the South to get to Philadelphia, to Independence Hall.
The Constitutional Convention, people started arriving in mid-May. It goes all the way through September. And a number of the delegates, for various reasons, personal reasons, professional reasons, had to leave and go back home and then return to the convention, which, to your point, that was no small task in 1787. They finally get a draft of the Constitution finished, something all the delegates could agree on. And on September 17th, 39 attached their names, signed it. They then transmitted the Constitution to the Congress under the Articles of Confederation that was meeting in New York, along with a couple of recommendations how they thought this new proposed Constitution should be ratified. And here's one of the great stories of the Constitution that I think Americans sort of take for granted or just ignore. Number one is the tremendous deliberation that happened during the summer of 1787.
Right.
I like to remind people there might be, in fact, just among the listeners right now, people who can hear us, there might be someone who could design a better constitution. Perhaps it's arguable, but it wasn't just one mind sitting down to bang out a constitution. It was a large convention, and different people with different opinions and different agendas and different interests. The Constitution had to be something that the whole Constitutional Convention could agree on. And then the second step was ratification.
Right.
It had to be something that the people of the United States could actually agree on. People, people in some place like Massachusetts who have really different ways of life and different interests than people in Virginia or people in South Carolina. And so to come up with a constitution that would appeal to all those different interests, all those different personalities, all those different agendas, and get ratified is actually a really incredible feat.
Well, and you think about the process that they went through to sell it, and we should talk about the Federalist Papers a little bit at one point during this, and their whole process of selling the population on the Constitution. But the other interesting part in this was, we're what, 10, 11 years past the Declaration. We had the Articles of Confederation.
Yep.
There were some key figures from the Declaration who wanted input on the Constitution, but weren't there. So you had that whole summer from May to September while they're negotiating, and they're getting letters coming in from Thomas Jefferson, and they're getting letters. I mean, you can't, again, there's no Zoom, there's no, they don't have this technology that we do today. They're sending letters from Paris, they're sending letters from Europe where they're acting as ambassadors, and Franklin's there and Jefferson's there, and they're all over the place.
Well, and you make a great point, Dave, and that is just to remind Americans today of the great challenge. We tend to talk about the founding fathers as if they were all part of one group or one club and all of the same mind. And it turns out there were gigantic divisions and oppositions within and among that group, including people like Patrick Henry, who was one of the staunchest supporters of independence. Right. He was a supporter of the Declaration of Independence. His speech famously, his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech in Virginia, it helped to move the important people within Virginia and across the United States to the decision to make war against their own government, the British government. And yet, when it came time to the Constitutional Convention, the same Patrick Henry refused to go. He famously said he smelt a rat. He didn't like what was being proposed to happen in the Constitutional Convention. So that's a big challenge to get over when you have someone like Patrick Henry saying, no, I'm not even going to participate because whatever comes out of that convention is not going to be any good.
Well, and then I thought we'd bring this up a little later, but you go all the way into then the conversation about the Bill of Rights, right? I mean, we went from Patrick Henry saying, I want no part in this, to another group of people saying, we need more of this. We need a Bill of Rights, right? And led really by Jefferson, who wasn't even there.
It's absolutely true. It's one of the great, that's one of my favorite subjects, is the whole subject of the Bill of Rights. It turned out to be a source of great controversy. Not all Americans at the time of the founding were in favor of a Bill of Rights. And when you actually look at that debate, it's quite illuminating in many ways about what a constitutional republic means. The key architects of the Constitution, including James Madison himself, the so-called father of the Constitution, and Alexander Hamilton, who wrote the bulk of the papers of the Federalists, both of them came out utterly, thoroughly, categorically opposed to any kind of Bill of Rights. And their argument is something I think it's sort of unusual, unfamiliar ground for modern Americans. Modern Americans have bought into this idea that what matters most is our rights. We got to talk about our rights, list our rights, protect our rights. Hamilton comes along in the Federalist Papers, and he said, if you really care about your freedom, don't list any rights at all. Because once you start listing rights, You're inviting judges and lawmakers and bureaucrats to start defining what those right, the right to free speech or the right to bear arms, right? You're inviting people to come and start defining, well, here's what we think free speech means and includes, and here's what it doesn't mean. And those guys said, don't get into the business of listing your rights. Rather, clearly enumerate the powers that we, the people, give to our government and stop. Stop right there. And then everything that the government does, the only question will be, did we actually give those in government that power or not? And that was the key argument why we should not have a Bill of Rights. Now, you point out Jefferson, and rightly so. He wasn't even there. He was in France. He was the ambassador. He's over there sipping French champagne, and he's weighing in. He's chiming in long distance through letters,
Right.
making the argument, oh, we absolutely need a Bill of Rights. And it's really interesting. In that big debate, you have Hamilton totally opposed to a Bill of Rights. You have Jefferson demanding a Bill of Rights, and you have Madison in the middle. Now, Madison is best friends with Jefferson, lifelong friends, but on this issue, he sides with Hamilton. Madison is a really good constitutional thinker, and he thinks his way through, and he thinks, Hamilton's right. We should not list any rights at all. We should just focus on keeping our government within the enumerated delegated powers we've given to them. And then people forget this. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, he got elected to the very first Congress. He announced that he was eligible, and back then they didn't really campaign on their own the way that we do. It was actually more civilized. They let other people campaign for them. But James Madison gets elected in the first Congress, and he shows up, and you know what he sees? He sees a whole bunch of people dissatisfied, angry at this new Constitution without a Bill of Rights. They want a Bill of Rights. And so Madison's looking around and he's thinking, what do I do? Hamilton was correct. He had the right argument. We should not have a Bill of Rights, but all these people really want one. And so Madison comes up with the idea. He says, here's what I'm going to do. I will write a Bill of Rights, and I'm going to write it in such a way that it will be totally redundant. It'll neither add nor subtract anything. So when you think of what became the First Amendment, it famously begins, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion.
Right.
And if you go look in the original Constitution, did we, the people, ever give Congress any power to make an establishment of religion, to pass a law respecting it? And the answer is no. And so all that it's doing, right, all the First Amendment is doing is just sort of restating a power that we never granted to our government. Those discussions during the Constitutional Convention, during ratification, and then during the debates over a Bill of Rights, that was a kind of public and political drama in the service of freedom that had really there was nothing like that in all the annals of history. It's amazing. It's as some of my friends back in Claremont like to say, it was worthy of Shakespearean poetry.
Well, there'd never really been an opportunity for that kind of a conversation to happen.
That's right.
I mean, if you think about all the monarchies and all of the Caesars and pharaohs and whatever other title that some so-called noble decided that they were gonna claim, they made the rules. There was no wait, you want to debate on what rights you? No, I tell you what rights you have, and that's it.
And here it sort of brings us to a really foundational concept. This too, I think many modern Americans have either forgotten about or just rejected it as old-fashioned somehow. The entire authority for the Constitution. If we raise the question, what makes the Constitution legitimate? Why is it the legitimate foundation of our government? Some people might say, well, the consent of the governed. We, the people, consented to this. Okay, but what authorized the people? They lived under a law. They lived under a former constitution called the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation, here's one interesting feature many people don't know. Just to pass a law under the Articles of Confederation required a supermajority. 9 out of 13 states had to agree just to pass a law. And then when it came to amending the Articles of Confederation, it required unanimity. All 13 states had to agree to amend the Articles of Confederation. And here's the real kicker. The Articles of Confederation contain no provision at all for replacing the Articles of Confederation. There was no mechanism in there that said, here's the legal process you follow if you want to get rid of this Articles of Confederation and adopt a new constitution. And before those people, I'm just going to for now say those people in North America, before they were living under the Articles, they were living under British law. And the British law had no legal mechanism by which these people could create a new regime, a new self-governing republic. Sure. And so here's my point. What is it that authorizes, what is it that makes it legitimate or right for this group of people in North America to think that they can consent to form their own government? And the answer is the natural right of revolution. If you trace this back all the way, it's that natural right of a people when they look at their own government, they realize our government's not protecting our rights. Our government is violating our rights. Right. We have the natural rightful authority, not a legal authority. We have a natural rightful authority to throw off that government and to establish a new one. That's what authorized the revolution, articulated in the Declaration of Independence. That was the foundation of the legitimacy of the Articles of Confederation, and it's the same foundation for the United States Constitution. Ultimately, the fundamental law of the United States rests on the natural right of revolution. So, Dave, there are arguably millions of Americans today who literally don't care about the Constitution. If you point out something that the government has done and you say, well, that was unconstitutional, I don't know, I'm just going to pull out some hypothetical, like maybe the president of the United States issuing a mandate about medicines, something like that.
Something that would never happen.
That would never happen, right? And you say, but wait, I've been reading my Constitution. The Constitution doesn't grant the president to do anything like that. It doesn't grant Congress any power like that. We have tens of millions of fellow citizens today who say, who cares if it's constitutional? If we think government should do something, then it should just go do it. Who cares if it's constitutional or not? I think this is one of our great crises of our republic today, is the fact that most of our fellow citizens don't even understand the basic necessity for a constitution, why it's a good thing to have a constitution.
I mean, I think at the core of that comment, and I know this is Constitution Week, and you've got another big speech tonight. I hate stealing your thunder a little bit, but I can't help it. You and I have spent too much time together.
Yep.
It's a trust issue. I mean, at the end of the day, this is an issue of trust.
Yeah.
Right? The people have said, we don't believe in the Constitution. We don't want a Constitution. We don't care about the Constitution, because they don't trust each other. They say, I trust Joe Biden. I trust Kamala Harris. I trust Nancy Pelosi. They're going to keep me safe from this virus. And instead, they should be trusting each other. And that's the very core foundation of a constitutional republic, is mutual civic trust.
If we had some big speakers right now, I'd put on Imagine Dragons and start playing that song where they sing about thunder, because you did just kind of steal my thunder there, Dave.
I apologize. We'll have a much bigger audience later.
But it's absolutely true. I mean, look, the founders, there were certain things about the modern world that the founders did not know. It's true. And there were certain timeless features of human nature and human society that never change, that the founders were incredibly wise about.
Sure.
They spent time studying it, thinking about it, reflecting, and in many ways they were correct. And here's one of them. When the founders looked at government in general, that general concept of government, they saw something that was utterly necessary and at the same time terribly dangerous. In fact, among the most dangerous of all human things. You need it. It in fact, several of them use this imagery. It's kind of like fire. We need fire for certain things. And I mean, we're in Grand Lake. Just a year ago, there were out of control fires. Some people here lost everything. Other people here came really close. The fact that Grand Lake is still here today is a wonderful blessing, maybe a miracle. Fire can be incredibly destructive and dangerous. Government is the man-made equivalent of a natural phenomenon like fire. It's something we need, but really dangerous. And that's why they said, let's do this. We're going to create a government, and we the people, which in itself is worthy of an entire graduate seminar.
Sure.
What it means to have a constitution with the first three words, we the people, not we the politicians, not we the king or we the church or we the bureaucrats, but we the people ordained and established this constitution.
As the business guy, can I just kind of chime in and remind everybody that we are doing that seminar probably starting in January?
That's right, we are.
So
absolutely,
just plug a little membership plug.
What that means, we the people. And we're going to create a government, and we the people are going to delegate to this government certain specific enumerated powers, all aimed at one grand purpose: to protect the individual rights, the individual liberty, the natural liberty of every citizen. And that's it. They made this decision that a government with a very narrow and specific purpose should have very limited enumerated powers. If you think about governments from the ancient world, if we said government is responsible for your entire well-being, it's responsible for the salvation of your soul. Yeah, I mean, that's laughable, right? It's hard to imagine Nancy Pelosi in charge of salvation of the souls, but imagine she was. Imagine that was the charge the American people gave to Nancy Pelosi and said, you're in charge of saving our souls and preserving our health and making sure that we're happy and virtuous, and you're in charge of our education and our food and our shelter. That kind of government would be a government of unlimited powers, right? That would have to be a government that would have total control over everything you think and do and say and everything. That's not, the founders went down a different path. They said, no. We don't want a government that's in charge of everything. Right. We want a government that does one simple thing: protect the private property and individual liberty of each and every citizen. That's it. And we're going to grant to that government certain enumerated powers. And here's the real stroke of genius of the founders. They said, just to make sure there's no confusion about what those powers are, we're going to write it down in an actual written constitution. When I was a student just starting to study politics, taking courses in international relations and things like that, I heard several references to the English Constitution, the British Constitution.
Right.
And I remember thinking, I don't know what that, I've never read that. I need to go read the British Constitution. And it took me a long time to figure out there is no British Constitution, right? The British Constitution is an amalgamation of a bunch of old monarchical decrees and some court decisions. In fact, this is one of the cutting edge discussions in English jurisprudence. What is part of the English Constitution and what is not? To avoid all that, the Americans said, let's actually have a written constitution. Right. We can make copies. Every citizen can read it for themselves and see exactly what few powers we granted to our government.
Well, and part of that goes back to the approval process, to actually getting the Constitution ratified. And so not only do we have just a written Constitution, but the guys who wrote it then spent pages sending out to all of the newspapers, and we get into the Federalist Papers, of having James Madison and John Jay and Alexander Hamilton putting together these newspaper articles and sending them all across the country and saying, not only have we written down the Constitution, we actually want you to understand what we meant when we wrote it.
You mentioned the Federalist Papers before, and we should say something about it. It was one of the great marketing campaigns in history. I mean, this is what makes the Federalist Papers really, really unique in the whole history of political literature. It is simultaneously, it is a philosophic treatise. One can read it and one learns historical truth, one learns truth about human nature.
Yep.
And at the same time, it's advertising. It is an advertisement for the Constitution. It certainly has a goal. It wants to persuade Americans that this proposed Constitution is pretty good. Nobody ever said it was perfect. It's just better than any other human written constitution they'd seen before, and that the Americans should be in favor of ratifying it. And in the pages of that book, one of the lessons that it's unmistakable if you actually read through the Federalist Papers is just how dangerous governments have been throughout all of history. I mean, the Federalist Papers is filled with really horror stories from Greek history, Roman history, medieval European history, what human beings do when they're drunk with power, when they have unlimited power over other human beings. It can be really ugly. It can be really unjust.
It's interesting. There's two things we can point to from that. The first is, or we'll come back to it, the last case study, and that our chapter members went over, and we talked about it over a couple podcasts. But this whole idea of should we have a standing army,
Right.
having a standing navy, not having a standing army, how long can an army be actually paid for, and everything else. The other side of it is you could tell what for the Federalist Papers, you could tell what they learned from Jefferson from the Declaration. And the Declaration is essentially the same thing, right?
Yeah.
You get into that bulk middle of the Declaration,
All those
and
grievances against
all those
the king.
grievances. It's all King George did this and this and this and this and this, and that's why he's bad, and that's why we should stop listening to him, and that's why we don't respect him as a king and a monarch, and we're going to go create our own country. They did the same thing in the Federalist Papers, only they went beyond England now, because now we were already independent. We were, it was our second constitution. Right. So they didn't need to air their grievances towards the king. They were now pointing out, here's the entire history of all the bad things that people have done when they got too much power. And therefore, we need to be afraid of government. Not only should we be afraid of government, we also need to be afraid of giving the government too much weaponry to go do everything. Gets into things like the right to bear arms. Whether it was necessary in the Bill of Rights or not, it's there.
And correspondingly, whether we should have a standing army or not. All these work together, because this is one of the great lessons. If political science, undergraduate, university level political science departments were worth their salt, if they were actually providing serious civic education, lesson number one on day one, the very first day of class, would be, first of all, an explanation of what government is. All governments, every government that's ever existed, is a monopoly on legalized force. And I want to emphasize the legalized part. Other people can exercise force. I can go walk out in the street here in Grand Lake and go punch someone, right? That would be force. But I'm exercising force in violation of the law.
Right.
Very quickly, I would be arrested and I would be charged with violating the criminal law. But when government acts, it is acting in accordance with law, on behalf of the law. It is the maker of the law. And so it's this monopoly on legalized force. And governments have been, historically, they have been the most dangerous human organization. Hands down, nothing else comes close. My academic discipline, I finished my PhD in political science, and there's a sub-discipline of political science called democide. And people who study democide study governments that slaughter their own people.
Right.
And I'm not talking about governments killing people like in the course of war, killing, in an invading army. I'm talking about governments that put their own people in death camps or starve them to death through government engineered famines, places like China and the Soviet Union and Cambodia and places like that. And the numbers are staggering.
Right.
In fact, there's great dispute among these social scientists over these numbers, because it turns out some murderous, tyrannical regimes like Nazi Germany, they were really good accountants. They kept detailed records of who they killed and how many they killed and all those things. And then you get to a place like the killing fields in Cambodia, and there are no neatly organized, detailed records. In fact, the way that social scientists try to estimate the number of dead is they go and they excavate. They get these big bulldozers and they start digging up earth and they start counting how many skeletal remains per square foot or square yard, and then they extrapolate and they estimate how many dead there are in these fields. And here's the point about all this. government can be immensely dangerous, more than any other kind of human organization. And so when we're talking about government, we're talking about an organization. It's the only organization in the world that builds prisons and gas chambers and puts armies out on a field. No business does that, right? No other no civic organization does that. Only government. So lesson one should be: this is a really dangerous thing. Anytime you let it exercise any kind of power, we should be watching it like a hawk. We should make sure that it's doing what we said it's supposed to do. And that's the danger of a modern progressive nation where citizens say, who cares if this latest bill or the latest executive order, who cares if that was constitutional or not? Well, the answer is, I care. You care. Those of us who care about freedom, we care a lot. And it's not necessarily that one particular bill or executive order was necessarily obnoxious. I mean, it probably was, but even if it wasn't, that's not the big point. The big point is we don't want our government exercising powers we didn't delegate to it.
And it sets a precedent that later on it becomes more difficult to stop the next one, right? And we said it earlier. Let's go back to this vaccine mandate, this completely unconstitutional vaccine mandate that Joe Biden has, or whoever's running Joe Biden, whoever's hand is behind him.
Let me put a little really fine point on it, because it turns out the way this works, it's not merely an unconstitutional executive order. It's an unconstitutional executive order that was issued to an unconstitutional federal level department, the Department of Labor.
Right.
That's what the Biden's executive order actually is. It commanded the Department of Labor to enforce this executive order, and then the Department of Labor issues rules to, I think it's OSHA. I believe it's the occupational.
Right. So that's three.
The third unconstitutional entity that is then enforcing this mandate on businesses that have more than 100 employees.
So the Constitution and the Declaration teach us that if your government starts to abuse its power, we have a responsibility, one, to remove the people from office, right? And then the first way to do that is through elections.
Yep.
How do I remove the head of OSHA, let alone the Department of Labor?
Right.
It's one thing to say, okay, I'm going to elect a couple senators. The Department of Labor, the head of the Department of Labor has to probably go through some sort of Senate confirmation. They go through Senate confirmation, and I can elect senators who will push back on that head of Department of Labor, because that person should have said, hey, wait a minute, I don't have that kind of power. I shouldn't be doing that. Not everybody's George Washington. George Washington's the only one who's going to sit there and say, I don't want that kind of power. Don't make me king. But so, I don't know how I can maybe see how I could get to the Department of Labor head through electing senators who would control that. I have no way of electing somebody who can control who's in charge of OSHA, sitting there saying, well, wait a minute, that's probably a little bit too far. We shouldn't do that. So they never do, and the bureaucracy grows and the bureaucracy grows. Our task as good citizens, according to the Declaration of the Constitution, to be virtuous citizens, is to use self-restraint and then self-assertion when appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
If we are to take our fourth precept, the right to revolution, who do we revolt against?
Right.
Are we revolting against Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, or are we revolting against OSHA? And I don't know how to revolt against OSHA.
Right.
I mean, it's one thing to just say, no, I'm going to ignore your rules, but that doesn't work so well.
Well, and look, I want to make sure that we're really clear. It is Constitution Week, so there's no better time to remind our listeners and our friends we are living under a regime that is to a large extent unconstitutional, to a very large extent. I mean, there is some good news. The good news is we do still have elections when the Constitution says we should have elections. That does happen. Representatives are up for election every 2 years. Presidents are up for election every 4 years. Senators every 6 years. Those elections do happen. Now, how much integrity there is to those elections is a different question. But we are having the elections we're supposed to have. And yet, we have this gigantic, bureaucratic, Leviathan state that governs us through regulations
Right.
issued by unelected bureaucrats. It's astounding, right? If you read through the Constitution never mentions a regulation, ever.
Right.
It describes how a bill becomes a law. And there's a pretty specific process. I mean, for example, right, bills for raising revenue, they actually have to begin in the House of Representatives. They can't actually they have to originate in the House of Representatives. And a bill is supposed to be, you've heard me joke about this, Dave. Everyone who's seen the old Schoolhouse Rock video,
Sure.
right? How I'm just a bill, right?
And I'm sitting
here.
And
it tells the story of how a bill becomes a law
Right.
in both chambers. And then you look at a regulation issued by OSHA and you say, well, wait a minute. This is not a law. This wasn't voted on by the House or the Senate. It wasn't signed by the president. And yet it has the binding power of law as if it's law. And right now, some of our listeners are probably they're probably thinking, is Krenwitter suggesting that all regulations are unconstitutional? Yes, hallelujah. Yes, all regulations. If there's one thing to take away from Constitution Week, it's that government by regulation is unconstitutional. There's no constitutional basis for it at all. And when that happens, when our elected officials ignore our Constitution,
right,
and they create unelected regulatory agencies, when they ignore our Constitution, they're ignoring us. They're ignoring what we consented to. And that is treading a very dangerous line when they start operating without our consent.
Well, I think we would be remiss for Constitution Week to not tie this all the way back to progressivism, right? I mean, the very foundation of what we talk about is the American idea was this good, this virtuous idea.
Yeah.
And the progressive idea is out to destroy it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So if we're going to bring this back to progressivism, let's remind everybody, it's probably been 4 or 5 months since we've really gotten into the foundations of progressivism and what it was about. This week of all weeks, it's probably the right time to remind everybody. So for new listeners, progressivism at its core, the entire idea is we are too stupid as citizens to make decisions for ourselves. We are incapable of doing this. So not only do we need to elect people who know better for us, but they're going to go find experts that supposedly the head of the Department of Labor, the head of OSHA, they know better. They're the experts.
Yep.
They know how we're supposed to live, what we're supposed to do.
Yep.
Let's let them run our lives for us. Now the question, how did that work out with the Secretary of State? Right? I mean, Secretary of State is a constitutional office, essentially. I mean, to an extent, right? I can see the look on your face. It's debatable, but there was a purpose, right? And there was a role designed for that in some form or fashion,
right?
Dealing with other countries and how we manage our relationships abroad. How'd the Secretary of State do in Afghanistan?
I would add in the Secretary of Defense too.
Well, Secretary of Defense,
the two of them together.
And then we've been watching. I don't know how much you got a chance to watch any of the congressional hearings that have been going on with the Secretary of State talking about what happened in Afghanistan.
Right.
And his answer was, we were given a deadline by the prior administration, and they didn't leave us with a plan. Does that mean in 9 months, Joe Biden and his administration were unable to come up with a plan for Afghanistan to withdraw from it? I think the majority of Americans were ready to leave Afghanistan. It was enough.
Mm-hmm.
But Trump wanted to in November, and then all of a sudden he saw, nope, Taliban's going to come right in. He bombed the Taliban. He attacked the Taliban. He pushed them back. He said, we're going to delay, and we're going to delay. And now we're a year later, and Joe Biden just said, I don't know what to do. Let's just get out of town and let's close the base for a second.
In a totally reckless, irresponsible way.
But it comes down to one of these things of, how are these experts performing? And I feel like this, as Constitution Week, has been our perfect opportunity to circle back on so many of the topics we've had over the last year and a half, where intentions matter more than results, right? You had good intentions, so we should be thankful, and at least you got out.
Here's I'm going to sort of summarize, but this is one of the great lessons that comes out of the American founding, and that is, if you create a government and you give it just a very, very few responsibilities, right? It's a dangerous world. Keep us safe in a dangerous world. Try to protect citizens in their liberty and their property. Give them just a few responsibilities. They're still likely to fail at some of those. They're likely to fail. If you give government an infinite number of responsibilities, if you say, hey, we think government should be in charge of healthcare, education, housing, right? Every subject under the sun, their failure rate's going to even go up. They're going to fail at more things more often because they're going to try to do all kinds of things that they're not very good at. And in a way, that's the story of progressivism. I have this image for the first progressive. Dave, have you ever seen a bratty little kid who wanted someone to do something and they wouldn't do what he wanted, and he throws a tantrum? Maybe he throws himself down and pounds his hands because someone won't do what he wants them to do.
It's often more specific than he won't do what they want him to do. They won't buy him what he wants, right? And that's so appropriate to our government scenario.
Yes, I want, right? The kid in the grocery cart, when mom has the kid in the grocery store, right? And the kid's in the cart and wants the special little toy. Mom says, no, we're not buying toys. This, and he throws a total tantrum, right? There it is. There's the origin of progressivism. I want to be able to make people do what I command them to do, and I want them to pay for what I want them to pay for. I want them to fund things that they might not want anything to do with. Doesn't matter. I'm going to use the power of government to make sure that they have to pay for it. At its core, it is control. At its core, it is envy. It is suspicion. It's distrust. I don't trust these people to just let them live freely like I'm living freely. I want to control and regulate them. This is the source of the progressive spirit that has not only really swept across the United States, it has swept across the world. When you look at the last century of the spread of communism, fascism, socialism, social scientists try to be fancy and make these fine distinctions between them, but really they all boil down to the same kind. Right? When some government soldier has his boot on your neck and he's pointing a machine gun at you, at that point you really don't care if he's a fascist or a communist. It's force, right? And a gun pointed at your head, making you do something you don't want to. It's the exact opposite of the very spirit of the American founding, this idea of individual liberty within a self-governing republic.
In honor of Constitution Week, if we are going to summarize, if we're gonna go over things, I think it starts with some basic understandings, and I think we should go back and remind people. The Constitution, first of all, was our second Constitution. We've alluded to that a few times the last hour, right?
Yeah.
Second Constitution. We tried the Articles of Confederation, decided those weren't the right way to go about things. We rewrote the Constitution. Doesn't mean it's perfect. Doesn't mean it can't be improved on. One of the brilliant things that our founders did was actually create an amendment process so that if they knew they were human beings like everyone else. Human beings aren't perfect. If it needs to be improved, Industrial Revolution changed things, everything else. They wanted to enable us to improve the Constitution.
They want us to be able to do something as noble and beautiful as the 13th Amendment. Right? We the American people, we amended our Constitution to abolish legalized slavery throughout the United States, and God bless America, we're better off for that.
And they even created a process where if we tried something, if we thought, you know what, this is going to make it better, we realized, boy, that was stupid.
Yeah.
Prohibition.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, prohibition. We pass a constitutional amendment.
Yes.
We say no more drinking. Well, no, actually, sorry, that was wrong. You're right.
What we did is we passed an amendment that prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. It didn't actually prohibit the consumption of alcohol.
So if you could figure out how to...
if you could make it rain alcohol, you could drink it. You just couldn't make it or buy it or transport it.
You know, in today's world, in today's Supreme Court especially, that manufacture word would have really been broken down into a lot of ways, right? I mean, I think about the old caveman style of really where beer came from. This was a fascinating documentary I watched once where a caveman just left a pot of wheat or barley or something out
yeah.
in the rain, and it rained and it sat there for days, and all of a sudden he drank it and he got drunk.
Yeah.
And that was the creation of beer. Is that manufacturing?
Yeah.
We have gotten so into the weeds about what does this word mean and what does that word mean? What does it mean to bear arms? What is a militia? All of these things.
That's right.
It would have been a fascinating conversation to have that today. But so we created all these great processes, but they were also a goal, and the Constitution was really a goal of solidifying or codifying the Declaration into law.
That's right.
Right? If the Constitution is the goal of creating codifying the Declaration into law, our job as citizens is to understand both the Declaration and the Constitution. That's why at the Vino Veritas Society we created our precepts, and then understanding what it is to be a virtuous citizen, to be able to follow through with that. And at the end of the day, to be a virtuous citizen, you have to want to be free.
Abraham Lincoln offered this wonderful imagery that's familiar with anyone familiar with the Old Testament. Comes from the book of Proverbs. He described the United States Constitution as a picture frame of silver that frames the apples of gold, and the Declaration of Independence, that's the apples of gold. And I think it's just a beautiful imagery, right, for how to think. The gold, the really important thing, that's the ideas, the principles in the Declaration of Independence. They're universal, they're eternal, they're true, they're beautiful, they're right. And the Constitution is very much a man-made thing. It was a bunch of human beings who designed it, which is why it's never going to be perfect, but it's pretty good. It's pretty good, and it's meant to preserve and protect, and to use Lincoln's word, to adorn those the apples of gold, those ideas in the Declaration. And this we began by talking about the preamble, and as we sort of get around towards the closing of our podcast, it wouldn't be a bad thing to go back to that. That preamble it truly is an amazing thing. For those who are not familiar, I will recommend Ronald Reagan's first inaugural address and just the first few paragraphs. Go back and look at the very first few paragraphs of his first inaugural address. He had been, of course, this is the peak of the Cold War.
Right.
And so Reagan had been studying the Soviet Constitution and Soviet law, Soviet government. And he said, the Soviet Constitution has all kinds of good sounding, the freedom of press, religious liberty, free speech. It's in there. It's in. Now, of course, the Soviet subjects don't actually enjoy those things, but their constitution does reference these things. And then he says, I was trying to figure out what is the difference between our Constitution, the United States Constitution, and the Soviet Constitution. And he says the difference is so subtle you almost miss it. The difference is this: theirs says, we, the political class, adopt this Constitution, and we're going to give these rights and privileges to the people. Whereas the United States Constitution says, we, the people, ordain and establish this Constitution. We, the people, are going to set out what powers we've delegated to the government we're creating. He said that's all the difference in the world. In the Soviet Union, if there's a question about your rights, whether you have a right or what a right means, you get on your hands and knees and you go to some government bureaucrat or a judge or a lawmaker, and you beg for permission to do something, which is connected to that whole fight over the Bill of Rights.
Or you just pay them off.
Or that's right. Or you pay them off.
Let's be honest. That's what happens more often than not.
Whereas under the United States Constitution, if we were obeying it, citizens would never be on their hands and knees begging for anything. It would be politicians on their knees wanting to do something, coming to the American people, begging permission. Please, I think you, the people, have allowed us to do this. We're going to pass this thing or do this thing. We want to make sure that you, the people, actually allow us in government to do it.
And to that end, I can't help but give you the credit for your favorite idea, and that is get rid of all taxes, get rid of all of that, and just make them go create GoFundMe accounts. right? If the government wants anything, put out a GoFundMe and come beg us for the money. And do something as good as what Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and James Madison did by creating things like the Federalist Papers.
Yeah. Go market it. Go market it.
And guess what? It's been perfectly clear to us. The government can do anything they want on Facebook and Twitter, So it makes it a whole lot easier for them.
That's right.
Right? I mean,
That's right.
they can go put it out on Facebook and
You want a
Twitter and try to
$3.5
convince
trillion
us.
stimulus package? Put it out on a GoFundMe page and ask Americans to support it.
Yeah.
And anybody who wants to support it, hey, you are free to knock yourself off and send as much money as you want towards that program. That's absolutely right. But that whole, that's what it means. I think if there's a theme to Constitution Week here in Grand Lake, and I've been coming here, I've been fortunate enough, they've asked me to speak, which is a huge honor for me, and I've done it a number of years.
You've done it 9 out of 10 years. You've been here the last 9
right.
years in a row, and I've joined you. This is my 5th year in a row with you here. It's been pretty cool.
And it's just the greatest thing in the world, right? It's beautiful. The trees are just starting to change. It's cool. The cold weather of the winter has not set in yet, but the heat from the summer's gone. It's fantastic.
And you have this.
You have all this behind us. And if there's a central theme to all this, it is to learn how to think like a citizen, think like a constitutional, self-governing citizen. Think about what that means, that we, the people, authorize the Constitution. If there's ever a great dispute or a great question over what the Constitution means, the ultimate judge, it's not Congress, it's not a president, it's not the Supreme Court. The ultimate judge of what our Constitution means is us.
Right.
We, the people. We're the ones who should decide what this thing means and what it doesn't mean. And the fact that this is our second Constitution is itself revealing of much. We exercise our sovereign choice, and we adopted a Constitution called the Articles of Confederation. And a few years into it, we said, yeah, we're not thinking this works. We, the people, we always reserve the right. We can always adopt a new Constitution. Hey, if we have the right to revolt and throw off a government, certainly we have the right to adopt a new Constitution, and we did adopt a second one. That means if we wanted to, we have the natural rightful authority to adopt a third Constitution. Now, I'm not proposing we go do that. I'm suggesting citizens think through what that means to have that kind of natural authority, that kind of natural sovereignty. If we have the right to create a third Constitution, a third form of government, it means our current government should be accountable to us, right, not the other way around.
And you bring that up, and that's going to be a big part of the topic of conversation for the remainder of Constitution Week, right? Mm-hmm. We're still early in the week. The remainder of the week, there are a few speakers who are talking about an Article 5 convention of the states. I have a lot of mixed feelings on that topic. There's some things that I think we do need to fix a lot of the problems that are out there. I'm also afraid personally of, and I've said this on our podcast before, I'm afraid of the lack of constitutional knowledge by the majority of Americans, that if we try to go get something passed, it's going to be worse than what we have before.
I'm going to put this out here. I'm the same way. I agree with you, Dave. I understand why people want a convention of states, and I too have certain reservations about it. There were some sharp minds in the original Constitutional Convention of 1787. There were people who devoted themselves before that convention to studying the history of constitutions, just to know as much as they could know about what kind of constitutions have been tried, what were the results, what worked, what didn't work. And in the first 3 weeks of the convention, there were serious arguments made that the United States should become a monarchy. In the Constitutional Convention, there were a number of people who said, look, this isn't working. This whole idea of a constitutional self-government or a republic, we don't know how to do this, but we do know how to do monarchy. We were all Englishmen. We all grew up under one of the oldest monarchies on the face of the planet. We know how to make monarchy work. And that idea was gaining traction in the Constitutional Convention. And that is when Alexander Hamilton had one of his finest moments on June 18th, 1787. He stood up and gave a 6-hour speech. And what he did is he challenged all of his fellow delegates. He said, if you're serious about a monarch, then let me tell you where this ultimately leads. And he paints this bleak, dark picture of what it would mean to have a monarchy back in the United States. And after his speech, the idea of a monarchy here in the United States was done. In the convention, everyone thought, okay, we do have to figure this thing out and get some kind of constitutional republic and get it right. Here's my point. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 required an Alexander Hamilton to save it.
Yep.
Will there be a Hamilton at a convention of the states today? Do we have someone like a Hamilton? Do we have someone like a Madison? Do we have someone with the gravitas of a George Washington, who was the presiding officer and was widely and deeply loved and respected by everyone there at the Constitutional Convention?
Even more importantly about George Washington, he would have likely been the king. If we had become a monarchy,
Yeah.
George Washington would have likely become the king. And you have to have somebody with that kind of gravitas who's willing to say, no, don't give me that kind of power.
Not only did he say no, he said no and shame on you.
Right.
You shouldn't be offering that to anybody. Don't offer that to me and don't offer that to anybody else. We're Americans. We are free, self-governing people. We shouldn't be living under a monarchy. The convention required a widely respected sage, wise mind there, like Ben Franklin. My point is, you had all these personalities and talents and that were so different and diverse and deeply needed. Would we have that in a convention of states today? I don't know that we would, and that's one of the things that worries me about a modern convention of states.
And if we do it, and if we have that convention of states, and I go back to this all the time, does that essentially just lead us to another French Revolution?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you have the Convention of the States, the rules change, the game changes, people want to start revolting against this new idea, and we end up in this cycle like the French Revolution of one after another.
I'll tell you this, Dave, if there's a convention of states and if there are good, serious constitutional minds, they're going to come from the ranks of the Vino and Veritas Society, because we're the ones guarding the ideas of the American founding. And since it's about ready to rain, I think this is probably a good place to wrap up our podcast.
I do want to say a quick thank you to Charlie's for letting us be here. If anybody comes up to Grand Lake, it is an amazing Mexican restaurant. With
a big, beautiful deck with a view overlooking
like
the lake.
This. So thank you very much, Charlie's. Thank you very much to the team at Constitution Week for having us this week. And
absolutely.
Until next week, we will continue to guard the American idea. No somos custodes.
Till next time.